Welcome back to the class. We are in the fourth session of this particular week, which is dedicated to look into the literature and the themes related to anti-globalization. Anti-globalization as well as imaginations of alternate globalization. So, I have titled this particular session as Imaginations of Alternate Globalization, and this is the combined session. This session as well as the next class will speak about the same theme, will be on the same topic. So, it will be a kind of a continuous class. So, please take note of that. So, the first session of this particular week, we started with the Empire, Hart and Negri's thesis, very influential work. And in the previous class, we discussed, we had a very cursory look at the very influential book, Globalization and its Discontents by Joseph Stiglitz. And in this class, these two classes, we are going to look at how there is a kind of an anti-globalization or movement for a counter-hegemonic globalization, or alternative globalizations have emerged in the last maybe 20-30 years, maybe since 1990s. If you have noticed, there have been quite a lot of very active anti-globalization movements comprising of workers' parties, students' movements, and feminist movements, and then grassroots civil society initiatives. They have been quite active. So, they are all kind of demanding an alternative globalization, and they are not against globalization per se, barring maybe some extreme forms of left parties, but everybody else wants a globalized world, but not the kind of globalized world that we are living in. So, let us see what are some broader features of this anti-globalization movements, grassroots movements, or what have been the important features of this alternate forms of visualization, visualizing alternatives. What are the ways, what are the kind of ideas that they have, what are the kind of strategies that they have, and how do they wish to implement these strategies and processes in a different way. So, we will touch upon criticisms against globalization, because we know that in the very first class itself, we discussed how globalization evokes very strong opinion from different sections of people. Some people celebrate it, some people are against it from various different vantage points. Please don't think that it's only the opposition to globalization is coming only from with respect to its economic consequences. There are quite a lot of communities, quite a lot of very powerful interest groups who are against globalization from the cultural point of view. They think that globalization is ruining their culture, and they don't want so much of an integrated or well interconnected world. They want to live in more kind of isolation. So, there have been worldwide movements and mobilizations, and especially this particular section, this particular theme is important, especially in the last maybe last 5 to 10 years. There is a consensus that what we are seeing is some semblance of a deglobalization, and it's a very contentious point. There are scholars who argue that you cannot have a process of deglobalization. You can't really go back to say 1980s or 1990s, and then it's not possible. But it's almost certain that the kind of optimism that once people had about a globalized world, about a global village, the world being seen as a global village, is no longer plausible. There have been very strong opposition against globalization. Very powerful leaders who are populist leaders, who are kind of described as populist leaders, who really play for their own domestic supporters, have come into picture in many countries. And Donald Trump is an excellent example of, because nobody kind of have predicted that a person like Donald Trump could ever become the president of America, and the kind of policies that he put forward, about migrants or laborers or a host of other stuff was all seen to be against the spirit of globalization, but that has happened. So there is resistance, alternative imaginations, coalitions and networks across the globe. And this also, of course, is a part of a critique of capitalism and its global institution, because we know that a very thoroughgoing criticism of globalization will always be based on critique of capitalism, especially the neoliberal forms of capitalism and its global institutions, as we have seen in the previous class, best exemplified by Joseph Stiglitz and his critique of IMF and the other institutions. And of course, they all lead to these are two very important themes that we have come across in recent times: global justice movement and environmental concerns. A discourse on justice of various kinds, justice with respect to economic opportunities, justice with respect to human rights, justice with respect to equality. A host of demands have been articulated through the language of justice, and of course about environmental concern. We know that how environment has now kind of come as a major theme, and first of all, environment is a global concern. We know that the depletion of ozone layer or global warming or greenhouse effect, pollution, all these are global problems. They are no longer problems of individual countries. We discussed that extensively when we discussed Ulrich Beck. So these are two important strands of mobilization as well as critique against a kind of a neoliberal globalization. So we know that the critique of, we are continuing the same point, critique of capitalism predates critique of globalization. We know that from ever since the time of Marx, there is a very strong criticism again from the left intellectuals or the scholars of economics who follow Karl Marx against the unsustainable nature of or the kind of a greedy or violent nature of capitalism, because Marx is very certain that capitalism is an extremely unstable economic system which will collapse soon because it has its own seeds of destruction. And because he said that it is an extremely exploitative system, it exploits the workers, and after some time it will collapse under its own weight. And it is an extremely extremely exploitative system, unkind system, least sensitive to the questions of equality or equal distribution or other difficulties of people. But we also know that capitalist system now is emerging as a very, very resilient system. It has emerged as a very resilient system. It did not go by what Marx had predicted, and we simply don't have any alternative in sight now. So for the Marxist tradition, globalization has since signified an oppressive hegemony of capital, and after the Great Depression and World War II, many critics have discussed the manner in which a discourse of modernization emerged to celebrate the growth of a globalized capitalist market system against its ideological and geopolitical competitor, state communism. So these Marxian scholars have been extremely critical of capitalism, but at the same time, the supporters of capitalism have presented capitalism as an inevitable ally or an extremely important component of this modernization story. And modernization, so we know that about this the bipolar world that existed till 1990s. On the one side, you had this Soviet bloc that represented the socialist values and socialist political ideologies, left political ideologies, and on the other hand, you had America and many of the European countries representing the capitalist, political positions and political and economic positions. So, this modernization was really presented as an alternative to that of the socialist route followed by these people. Now, at the end of the 20th century was the first popularly termed the anti-globalization movement, the beginning of a global civil society that might produce new public spheres of political debates and cosmopolitan culture. as it upholds values of autonomy, democracy, peace, ecological sustainability, equality and social justice. So, if you look at, we have discussed it in many times, when do we really locate the emergence of globalization? Is it immediately after Second World War, or does it go back to the period of colonialism, or does it still go back to the pre-modern period, or does it really begin with the, say, 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union? So, there is no consensus, but still we know that the collapse of Soviet Union really is an extremely important historical moment that kind of declared that socialism as a political and economic ideology is fraught with problems, and then it seems to be least sustaining, especially when you have its competitor, that is a capitalist system, thriving almost across the globe. So, at the end of 20th century, it was maybe the first time that this whole term anti-globalization movement became more important, and that also saw the emergence of a global civil society. Okay, a civil society is usually understood as a set of organizations that really represent the citizens, and then and they engage with the state on behalf of the citizens. So, civil society that might produce new public sphere of the political debate and cosmopolitan culture as it upholds values of autonomy, democracy, peace, ecological sustainability, equality and social justice. So these were the kind of beliefs and the kind of ideas and the kind of imaginations that were behind these civil society initiatives and public sphere that emerged after that. So, with the beginning of new millennia, with 2000s, more targeted criticisms began to emerge, with anti-corporate globalization movement and the social justice movement gaining currency. So, by 2000 we see it's no longer the criticism of the old school left group who would blindly condemn globalization because it is capitalist, or who would completely characterize globalization as only as the handiwork of multinational corporations and the US hegemony. But you see more targeted, more sophisticated criticisms against anti-corporate globalization movement. So, they would argue that globalization by itself may not be bad, but globalization in the current form is being hijacked by this corporate lobbies, multinational companies, very few individuals and very few people who want to concentrate the wealth in their own hand, and at the cost of all these things that we discussed earlier. And they have and we see the emergence of social justice movements from across the globe. The anti-corporate globalization movement initially began to receive widespread recognition in 1999, when the first is an ongoing series of large international protests was staged, and we are talking about this World Social Forum and similar kind of congregations across the place. Many of these protests started targeting WTO, World Trade Organization, the World Bank, IMF, as well as conferences such as Davos and World Economic Forums and G8 summits as central to the growth and future planning of unjust globalization. So, if you look into the history of these protests, you see there were quite a lot of very spontaneous uprisings staged against these institutions. There were popular protests in front of the Davos World Economic Forum, and this whole idea of a World Social Forum was conceived and then executed as an alternative to this World Economic Forum. And whenever there were G8 summits, there used to be huge protest in front of that. Many times this protest turned violent. So, you see this kind of tensions and mobilization simmering from 1990s, late 1990s onwards. The anti-corporate globalization movements include political and cultural organizations involving in more traditional political structures such as unions and parties, as well as non-governmental organizations, NGOs, along with a wide range of citizen groups and individual persons representing what has been termed as the new social movements. So, it's very interesting to look at the composition of these protest groups. So, these protest groups include a wide array of parties and organizations and collectivities which represent the old-fashioned political parties. The political parties may be left parties or other kind of labor unions, and then you had this NGOs with more formal structure, and a host of new social movements that are a phenomenon came into existence maybe after 1990s, which have gone beyond the idea of a class or gender, and say the collectivities based on identity, sexual identity, linguistic identity, or other kind of a cultural identity, environmental groups. So these, so if you look into, for example, I would request you to have a look at the reports on World Social Forums. So it's an amalgamation of hundreds of different types of groups coming and then putting forward their claims and their assertions and other things. It's a group of almost every conceivable kind of organizations and interest groups that represent. So many scholars and activists began to reject the moniker of anti-globalization altogether, because anti-globalization looks very problematic, because it raises the question, are you really against globalization? Okay, or if first of all, is it a feasible position to reject globalization entirely? Okay, so if you want to reject globalization entirely, what else is the alternative? Do you want every country to be disconnected and then isolated? Sorry, excuse me. So instead, people often speak of globalization from below as opposed to globalization from above, anti-capitalist or anti-corporate globalization of the alter globalization movement and of the alternative globalizations of the global justice movement or the movements of movements. There is a space here. Okay, so these are the kind of alternative terms that are used instead of the term anti-globalization, because anti-globalization, as I mentioned, is problematic. So it could be globalization from below, because globalization from below means that these things are not enforced or they are not entrusted on them. Rather, people willingly connect with each other beyond the nation state and then have kind of a cultural and economic exchanges in doing that. So alter globalization, alternative globalization, global justice movement, or the movements of movement. These are all the terms that have been used to describe these kind of movements later. Because these movements themselves are products of globalization and are extensively using its infrastructure. Because that many of, for example, is World Social Forum. World Social Forum is possible only because of globalization. Even though they are criticizing globalization, it is a product of globalization. Because without the infrastructure of globalization, without the imagination of a global whole as a single unit, an organization like or an event like World Social Forum would have been impossible. Okay, so many of these organizations, they realize that. So they are not against globalization per se, but they are against globalization which is taking place in a very perversive way, in a very exploitative way. So political idea of a global solidarity based on the tremendous diversity of resistance to be found in today's mainstream ruling practices, neoliberal capitalist economics, repressive cultural norms and other aspects of global society that lead to increasing gap between rich and poor and between this oppressed and oppressor. So this is the basic argument. So that these many completely diverse groups are coming together to fight economic policies, to fight ruling parties, to fight the repressive cultural norms that only increase the kind of a gap between rich and poor, or which only consolidate the kind of the issues between the oppressor and the oppressed. So these movements work both to counter and reform at once. So that's a very interesting thing. These alternative globalization movements, they at the same time they are resistance movements, because they are resisting the kind of a current unfolding of globalization, and at the same time they also want to present something alternative. They also want to present an alternative thing. So they also want to reform it once, with some social movements working for the direct and participatory democracy and autonomous communities. Sometimes utilizing alternative economic structures such as local exchange trading systems. On the other hand, while others seek truly representative and democratically accountable national and global political structures on the other. So, if you look into what kind of alternatives are they offering, it's very interesting. It includes maybe one group want to focus on the community level. They want the communities to be self-sufficient. They want the communities to be more autonomous. Autonomous in the sense they must have all the right to regulate themselves, their social, political, and cultural spheres, and even local exchange trading systems where the small communities engage in a kind of a less ruthless, less profit-oriented exchange system between other communities. So, there are initiatives which focus at the local level dynamics. At the same time, there are initiatives which focus at the global level to make how the global political structures and these international economic institutions are to be more accountable, more democratic, more sensitive to all these questions. Now, in the couple of coming slides, I want to discuss this idea about this counter-hegemonic globalization by Peter Evans, this American sociologist. So, he has something very interesting to say about how people perceive these things. So, neoliberal globalization, corporate globalization, or neoliberal corporate dominated globalization is nothing natural, and counter-hegemonic globalization can be built. So, this is very simple but persuasive argument. So, he would argue that the kind of a globalization that we are witnessing today, which is kind of characterized as neoliberal globalization, corporate globalization, or neoliberal corporate dominated globalization. Okay, this is nothing natural. There is nothing natural about it. There is nothing natural about it. There is nothing unavoidable, essential about it. It's not that it's a fate that we all have to live with that, but we can. It's possible to build a kind of a counter-hegemonic globalization can be built. So, that's what I mentioned earlier. It's a visualization. It's an imagination about an alternative world. The growth of transnational connections can be potentially be harnessed to the construction of more equitable distributions of wealth and power, and more socially and ecologically sustainable communities can be built, and this counter-hegemonic counter-hegemonic globalization. So, the argument is that these transnational connections are inherently exploitative. They are not. Transnational connections are not inherently exploitative. Okay, but what instead you can use these transnational connections to be harnessed to the construction of more equitable distribution of wealth and power, and more socially and ecologically sustainable communities. So, more socially and ecologically sustainable communities and economic growth can be built under this kind of an imagination, according to Peter Evans. Three broad families of transnational social movements aimed at counter-hegemonic globalization: labor movements, women's movements, and environmental movements. So, Peter Evans believes that three sets of movements. Okay, each of these movements are not singular entity. They are all diverse, heterogeneous groups in themselves, but you can broadly categorize these three into that's why he is using the term broad families of transnational social movements. One is the labor movements, which represent labor interest. Second is women's movement, the feminist movements in different parts of the country. And the third one is the environmental movements. Environmental movement which has concerns about environmental issues across the globe. Now, he argues, Peter Evans argues that around the globe, from Mumbai to Johannesburg to Shanghai to the Silicon Valley, jobs are being informalized. Okay, jobs are being informalized, outsourced, and generally divorced from anything that might be considered as a social contract between employer and employee. So, this is an extremely important point that we need to keep in mind. We have discussed even earlier when we discussed Ulrich Beck that the very idea that somebody after his or her education will get a permanent job and a person will work in the same company until his or her retirement at the age of 60 or 65 and then will be happy with a pension. Okay, that kind of an imagination, that kind of a understanding has been very badly affected in the recent times, because more and more jobs are kind of informalized. The number of permanent employees are reducing significantly, and every countries have passed laws and new labor laws that help these companies to informalize their workforce. So every major company will have very less number of people who are considered as their own employees, and vast majority of their workforce will comprise of casual laborers on contract, who are completely outside many of the legal requirements of providing welfare, safety, labor safety and other things. While industries want these kind of regulations in terms of efficiency, in terms of in terms of maneuverability and profitability, the workers are at a very disastrous situation, because it's almost impossible to get permanent jobs. There's no guarantee to your job, and mostly you are forced to work as temporary contract laborers. So that is what the whole informalized work, where work is outsourced, and you might be assigned for a particular period in point, and after that you will be asked to leave, or your job contract comes to an end, and that becomes the kind of a most predominant mode of employment. Okay, and that, he argues, it has become a global phenomenon, and anything might be considered as a social contract between employer and employee. So here the very idea of a social contract between employer and employee very badly suffers here, because there is hardly anything that really binds these two entities together. So precisely because the attack on the idea of labor as a social contract is generalized across all regions of the world, it creates a powerful basis for generating global labor solidarity. So his argument is that this is a situation that workers are facing across the globe. Increasing pressure of informalization, decreasing wage rate, okay, decreasing working conditions, very demanding working conditions. The kind of facilities provided to the workers are being withdrawn in many places, and this is a global phenomenon. Okay, in one particular place, if the company finds that the workers are demanding too much, then they will shift the entire operation factory into another country where cheap labor supply is readily available. So this, he argues, that is already provides a kind of an existence of a vibrant set of workers who can be harnessed for staging a kind of counter-hegemonic globalization. It creates a powerful basis for generating global labor solidarity. A host of examples of workers' movement across the globe, Brazil, France, Germany, and so on. You must have seen that the workers protesting many times, it turns out to be violent, and there's police shooting, arson across the globe, in the US, in across the place. So these, he argues, is that so that the labor really represents one of the very important families of social movements. Second one is that his argument is that the global neoliberalism has brought issues of gender to the forefront of transnational social movement organizations in a dramatic way. Until there has been a revolutionary transformation of gender roles, the disadvantages of allocating resources purely on the basis of the market logic will fall particularly harshly on women. And this is yet another very important argument. You know that in the feminist literature, there is very fascinating arguments about the relationship between capitalism and gender. How capitalism as a structure, as an economic system, is antithetical to the interest of the woman, and how this whole capitalist system, starting with the factory system, in which the men go to the work and women stay back at home taking care of the household activities, was seen as the natural way of doing work. And after some time, how it systematically naturalized women's household work, And so that when somebody asks you, what's your mother doing? You would say that my mother is not doing anything, she's not working. That's the usual thing that we all say, forgetting or not realizing the amount of work that an ordinary woman does in her kitchen or in her house from early morning to late evening. Okay, and that work is kind of unrecognized, it's unacknowledged, it's not remunerated, it remains as as wageless work. So unless a revolutionary transformation of gender roles take place, the disadvantages of allocating resources purely on the basis of market logic will fall particularly harshly on women. Because if you are only concerned about efficiency and profitability, then that will be extremely biased against women. Structural adjustment and other neoliberal strategies of global governance contain a built-in systematic gender bias. And there's no doubt about it, because unless these gender roles are drastically transformed, and we know that even in houses where the woman goes to work, she's doubly handicapped, because she has to do the office work and also she has to do the household work. And there are maybe the families in which both the men and women are equally contributing the household works would be very, very minimal. We all can look into our own houses and then see how this household work of cleaning, cooking and washing and other things are predominantly a kind of a woman's work. And so that's a very important thing. So this UNDP talk of a global care deficit, pointing out that the women spent most of the working hours on unpaid care work, and adding that the market gives almost no reward for care. So taking care of the small children, taking care of husbands, taking care of elderly parents. So this entire care is unrecognized. It's unrecognized, it's unpaid, and it's not even in acknowledged. So he would argue that, or this has been argued by scholars widely, especially feminist scholars widely, that women's work remains invisible, unrewarded, or unpaid or underpaid in a globalized capitalist system. So I think I will take a break now. We will stop here and we'll come back with the rest of the class in the next class. Okay, another maybe 10 slides are pending. We will continue the same discussion after a break. That will be for the next class. Thank you.